Welcome to Getting to Know You. This time it's 3 residents, and we are doing this program in order to honor another way of honoring the veterans in our midst, which is what we do for Veterans Day, when we still can talk with them about their experiences and thank them for their service. So we, I think, all know about the celebration of the ending of World War II at 75 years. Well, the world didn't close down for young people, for young men at that time, because the draft was still in existence. And we're going to talk to 3 people today who were experiencing that draft at a time when young people are looking to their future, and the draft was one of those issues that had to be addressed at that time. And they have interesting stories to tell. So I'm delighted to have sitting around the table here, and a flag for each to salute them, 3 of our midst who experienced that time and are willing to talk about it a little bit with our Getting to Know You program today. So at the cross from me is Sid Willis, and in the middle is Joe Stoniker, and next to me is Joe Lampiurello. I have to say it slowly, okay? And we're going to start off just with asking them what it meant to be a young person, know the draft was in existence, the war was over, and what was going to happen to you. And so Sid, where were you when people knew that they still had to prepare for going into the service because they would be asked to come?
Yes, I was in college at the time, which was quite fortunate because I got a deferment and was able to avoid the draft, although I registered for the draft in Chicago. Oh, I have to speak over here.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, right.
Go ahead.
So I registered for the draft in Chicago, but for 2 years I stayed in college, which had its moments, but eventually I was drafted, and I returned to Chicago in time to sign up. And so that meant that it was already in the 1950s, in the early 1950s, that I ultimately went into the service. I served 23 months in the Army, and during that time the most outstanding events were always delays and lost papers, not my fault, and lost time. But I eventually went to Fort Knox for basic training.
Okay, you went to Fort Knox for basic training, and you didn't know what you were going to do next.
Right.
And do you have fond memories of basic training, or?
Well, it was really, as I say, as I have said in a paper I wrote about this, the Army in those days was not nearly the harsh series that it had been portrayed as in earlier times. And I did what I had to do to live in pup tents and rush around getting in shape and learning about weapons and such. But as I have said, because of being assigned to the Caribbean Command, eventually, after many months being assigned to the Caribbean Command and going there by ship out of Bayonne, I had a fairly comfortable life waiting for the next step, which never really happened.
I guess waiting is part of the game.
Waiting
Joe, what was your experience?
For the draft?
Yeah.
I was registered for the draft out of Princeton, New Jersey, my hometown. And I was deferred for 4 years while I was in college. And thought I had escaped because now the draft was sort of calming down because the Korean War was calming down. So unfortunately, I had a wonderful time after I graduated from college. I went to the Jersey Shore and I worked as a bartender. And one day I got a letter from the draft board saying you have been drafted. Now, at one time, I was in the Naval Reserve, and so I rushed down to Philadelphia and joined the Naval Reserve again and ended up in the Navy.
You did.
And I went to boot camp and did all those things.
And boot camp, you just managed to get through it, okay?
Oh, yes. I was the information officer in my platoon. And but my responsibility was that every member of the platoon had to pass the course. This was the written course, not the physical course, by the end of their time in boot camp. And we did 98%, I think. So that was it was a, for me, this whole experience, and I'll tell you later, was a maturing experience, because I needed it, frankly. Yeah.
Good. All right, Joe,
Yes.
your story is a little bit longer.
Well, it is, it isn't. I was deferred
Another deferral.
to complete a semester at school, and then I was called up for physical examination, and they found that I had a problem with blood pressure. And,
As a young man with blood pressure, yeah.
right. It wasn't real high, but it was enough to disqualify me. So I went about my way. I started working for an accountant. I had intended to become a CPA, and I worked for the accountant, and then I changed my mind. Then I thought I would join my father. My father was superintendent of a plant manufacturing Hatter's fur,
Oh, okay.
which I don't know if anybody here is familiar with it, but it's a job of removing fur from the skin of rabbits and hare skins and beaver and so forth. And so I went to work there. I left the financial field, and I went to work with my father. And lo and behold, get a notice from the Army.
Greetings.
Greetings. Report to Governor's Island, which I did. And I sat there for 3 days and had my blood pressure checked several times a day. And after the 3 days, I was notified that I was now acceptable for the Army. So I was inducted and shipped out to Fort Knox, Kentucky, and had to guard the gold out there.
Right.
So I was in the program for the light field artillery, and I completed that stay, and lo and behold, as I was finished, I got a call and went to the orderly room,
Okay,
and that was usually,
I think we should stop there because, well, I won't give away the story, okay? As these guys were sent off someplace.
well, I was eventually lined up to go
Right, I
someplace.
know. We'll tell the end of the story, okay?
Okay.
All right, Sid, now, you mentioned Panama and going to the Caribbean. So you went off to Panama, and what did you do in Panama? What did the Army think was important to be done in Panama?
Well, I was fortunate there was an opening for someone to take over the troop information and education area for a base in Panama, Fort Kobe. And I was given that job, and since I seem to have done it well, I kept that to the very end of my service. I got very comfortable in Panama. I had a private room. I got a promotion. I went around giving speeches to the troops as to why Korea. That was my favorite speech. And I also gave speeches on your reserve requirements, which was not as well received. I assembled a library there. Of catalogs, college catalogs. I gave the special examinations for high school completion and even for up to 2 years of college credits to both the officers there on the base and the troops. And ultimately I was offered the opportunity to go home about a month early because there was room aboard the ship that was leaving from Cologne. And so in one day I cleared the base, got rid of my rifle and all my equipment and clothing, and went by ship and via Cuba to New York, and was flown back out to Chicago where I had started this sojourn. And
Could I ask you to tell about one thing that when we had a conversation about this before, that you were tasked with working with soldiers who were from Puerto Rico?
yes, that was a major assignment. Eventually,
Yeah.
the Puerto Rican troops, which were still Spanish-speaking, had been in Korea and had gotten their years in, and the Army was anxious for them to stay in the service, and so they set up a program for processing them as to how well they could speak English, classifying them as to which route they would take while they were in Panama with English-speaking companies.
Right.
And we ran a school with about a dozen people teaching English. And I took care of the bookkeeping and the facilities we used. And that was quite interesting. I was there until the very end.
I think it's interesting as we think about this military service being strategic and trying to figure out what needs to be done to keep the military going. We never really see those kinds of background issues. Joe, what happened with you once you got into the Navy?
I'm in boot camp, and they gave some sort of exam I took. And at the end of boot camp, they told me I was assigned to guided missile research.
Wow.
Who knew I wasn't a scientific person, but I was assigned to guided missile research, sent to a place called Dam Neck, Virginia, which is a mile from Virginia.
Dam Neck, is that?
Dam Neck, yes.
Oh, okay.
And it's about a mile from Virginia Beach, so that I went to school there for 8 months.
Was it a secret place?
No, but we were taught some secret things which we weren't supposed to disclose. And then I was sent to the USS Mississippi, and I spent the time in surface-to-air missiles. We fired our missiles at drones that came from Virginia. We were off the coast of Virginia sailing around. The Mississippi was very interesting because it was a World War II battleship that had been converted into a guided missile boat. The aft turrets were made into rocket launchers, and our job was to telemeter the firings or the misfirings, which we had from time to time, to perfect the system. I found it a very interesting experience. I found that on board ship a very boring experience. I started an accounting course, which It's not something I'm proud of. And it's boring. And if it was boring for us, and there were only 45 of us
Yeah.
in a separate section, it was very boring for the 1,500 men who were cruising around with us.
It took to run the ship.
That's right,
Yeah,
yeah.
but you felt you learned something.
Well, I learned several things. I learned something about science, and I definitely learned something about maturity, which I needed desperately at that time in my life.
Good. Now, Joe, I interrupted you after your blood pressure was considered to be just fine,
Right.
normal. And then what happened to you?
Well, then I was drafted, and then I was sent to Fort Knox, Kentucky. And after I completed the basic training, it was called the orderly room, and I was given two choices, OCS or CIC.
Okay, now you have to tell us what both of those are. in
Well, OCS,
words.
Officers Candidate School.
Okay, all right.
And the CIC was a counterintelligence course, which was the predecessor of today's CIA.
I think I am.
And so I chose the CIC. And that was broken up into two groups, one for Germany and one for Japan. And I wound up in the group for Germany. So I went to school in Maryland under the guise of Halliburton Signal People. We had no signs outside indicating that it was a CIC school. So I took the course there, and I graduated from the course, and I was recommended for further training. But in that course, I had a year of German, basic German, and all other skills relevant to opening letters and picking locks, and photography, and with the latest very nice equipment we had for photography. But anyway, as President Truman then signed the law ending the draft, so I was free to go home. But I didn't go home. Somebody came down with a communicable disease, and we were quarantined. So we just sat.
But what was the disease?
I don't know,
Chicken pox.
And we sat there until we were free to go. So then I went over
So all of that training.
but all that training, but it comes in handy from time to time. If I get locked out someplace, I had the tools to open up locks. And no, it was good all around. We had public speaking, and we had, picking locks, and
Steaming open envelopes?
that too. And all in all, it was good training.
Right.
It was interesting.
Right.
And then I was discharged from there.
And you went on to a career.
But then I had given up on the accounting end of it,
Right.
so I got into manufacturing, where I spent the rest of my life. But at the end of my career, the division I was in was closed, and I was ready to retire. And someone, the man in charge, had another business. And the fact that I had started out in accounting, he said, come with me. So I was able to work another 8 years doing nothing connected with the first job, but I knew about it on imports.
Right.
We knew every ship that one came in and out of the United States, every port, when they were due and so forth, because we imported all the raw material. So I got with that. But anyway, I worked, as I said, with the other division, which was all imports. And, well, they had both manufacturing and imports.
Yeah, I think you said you worked with Chinese import in the very
We-
early days.
The first,
Yeah.
we had a supplier in England who had good contacts in China. So we bought Chinese bone glue. It was the world's worst they threw everything in a sack that you can imagine, whether it be steel or wood or whatever, to make up weight.
Uh-huh.
But anyway,
Think of what?
to give it weight because they paid by weight. And, but that wasn't supposed to be in there,
Mhm.
but it was so cheap that we could afford to clean it up,
Yeah.
take the junk out and so forth. So that was in
That was the early days.
1972,
Yeah.
that's when it opened up.
Mhm.
But everything had to go to England first,
Mhm.
and then from there it had to go to Canada.
Mhm.
And then in the wintertime, it would go to Nova Scotia, and then by train into Montreal. In
Mhm.
the summertime, the ships would go right into Montreal. So we would take it from there, and had to go to New York State.
Yeah.
So I was involved in all the
So all the
letters of
trading,
credit
yeah.
and so forth, the banking.
So it wasn't the military, but it opened a new
No.
world for you to,
Right.
yeah,
It caused me to change course.
right. Now, I think both of you said that when you came back, you hadn't given up on school and the GI Bill was in
Oh,
effect.
yes,
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
that's how I went to law school,
Mhm.
on the GI Bill. Yeah,
And you went to graduate school then, Sid?
Yes, I did.
Yeah. What an opportunity.
yes, it's an
But I didn't tell
opportunity.
you what I did. I went to Arthur Murray's teacher school for dancing.
Oh, okay, wonderful.
Okay.
Okay,
Well, these are great stories, but, you know, they're not just great stories. They really meant that you had to change your life. You had to think about other matters that were important for our country and willingly take on the responsibilities of being in the military and doing what was considered important for our country. And I think we owe you a debt of gratitude and the many other people who were serving at your time and when the world was changing. So these three flags here on the table represent that little thank you. And actually, those three flags represent one for each of the 10 people who were on our list of veterans who are being honored at this time at Stonebridge and thanked for their service. Because I think if I counted right, there are 30, and 2 of those are women. And so thank you for telling us your stories and having us gain some insights into what it meant to be young at a time when the world was still as it is today, with many problems and us depending on our government to figure out how to keep us secure and safe. But today we don't have the draft. It's not that uncertainty, and we think of it in our grandchildren's lives as it was probably when you were first drafted. So that comes with thank you from Stonebridge, from all of us here. But I think you probably sense that you did your country a great service at the same time that you changed and if I can go by you, Joe, grew up.
Grew up.
And thank you for coming to getting to know you today and meeting these 3 veterans and hearing their stories and joining me in thanking them and all the veterans here at Stonebridge. Thank you.